Guys, I just want to know what's the weirdest shape a spirit's taken upon appearing before the circle for you guys?
Oh God. Um, what forms haven't they taken? Let's be real. One of the ones that sticks with me was the one that I wrote about in some vague detail on with Cunning Command about the evocation of Faust's Mightiest Sea Spirit,
Mhm.
um, namely Kiramandani, where initially he took the form of like a bloated corpse with like all of its limbs smashed to pieces and like broken, that dragged itself out of a riverbank where light and fog and water had all turned red. So seeing that aggregate and do like a Wolfenstein style jump scare at the circle was certainly memorable to say the least.
Wolfenstein jump scare.
um,
Oh.
One of the other ones that I remember was like the demon chihuahua, for lack of a better term, where it was like this featureless, low polygon, quadrupedal barking mouth that was like running around and trying to bite at my legs. That one was funky. That wasn't even the
Mhm.
spirit I was calling either. That was just some fucking guy.
Oh,
Oh
that's
my
good.
goodness. I mean, I was gonna make a joke about like the spirit that shows up as your mom telling you get off the computer with her plate of chicken nuggets. The
Oh
bane of
no.
many occultists. No, I actually it's when they take the form of like children, especially like youths that have that kind of angelic, off-putting kind of beauty that is like
Mm-hmm.
unsettling and like they don't fully move as that uncanny valley effect. Makes you think of all like the stories of like Lucifer, for example, showing up as like a young man,
Mm-hmm.
or like a youth. Very unnerving when they show up. Their essence is technically bound to the circle, but they show up visually outside of it. And in a way that kind of makes you want to leave the circle and confront them in the corner of the room, but it's actually like a projection that they're making.
Hmm.
Also, the ones that show up with like skin in like layers, like think like the Elephant Man, like just layers of wax or like almost a curdled milk like texture to their skin that is just pouring over orifices to the point that like you can barely see their mouth or eyes, like kind of grunting and groaning underneath the weight of it all. That could be spooky. Or
Mm-hmm.
ones that have like multiple mouths coming out of their bodies as tumors. It's like,
Oh yeah.
yeah,
That's
there's
it.
they they try and show up and they freak you out a little bit, but something a very long time ago, one of my primary spirits told me, uh, think of what would disgust you, like what would genuinely make you feel so like visually repulsed, and find a way to get over that. Because that is something that a combative spirit will immediately take if they figure out that's what you fear or are, disturbed by.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And so, whatever that might be, figure it out and find a way to overcome it. Not necessarily by stealing yourself or becoming like tough, but I think just by like almost practicing a level of mindfulness, for lack of a better term, to be like, oh, you're doing that to upset me. And then like the emotional distance can be created. Or to be like, I'm not easily provoked. Like you can't just like, oh, like I find that like laughter is a good way to deal with it. Like you notice that I laugh as well to diffuse all kinds of things in my life. But one thing that I do with combative spirits is I'm just like, oh, like you really think you could get to me like that? Like, oh, it's how original.
Oh yeah. It drives them up the wall as well. Like especially the proud ones. That they do not like. But the other side of that, the other side of that is the spirits that intentionally appear in a way to make you laugh. Or
Oh,
like
yeah.
comical forms, and it's like they're trying to catch you off guard, and it's just like they're they're playing 5D chess, man. They're playing 5D chess. Like you got to prepare for everything, and
Mm,
yeah, it's funny.
Comedy show from the 1500s, court jester maxing.
yeah.
You're like, brother, what?
Be not alarmed at the frightful howls which you may hear. It's Sfinga, Salt, and Binding the Foul Spirits key. Because boy, have we seen some shit. It's like I can't even do like you can't even do like a humorous cold opening. It's like remember guys when like that crazy shit happened? Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, for real. Just like grizzled, like sitting at the bar somewhere. It's been like,
Punished key, like punished
yeah.
Solid Snake. Yeah,
Listen, if you don't have a little bit of PTSD, are you really doing Grimwald work?
yeah.
Like, yeah, question.
Oh my God.
Oh man.
But it's not all that bad. Remember, you can check us out at patreon.com/the frightful howls. For your tonics, for your wares, for your antidotes against a confusion of spirits, we have a bonus episode every month carried by and just for our patrons. We got a Discord server, Salt's Fantastic Almanac, a monthly live occult book club where we discuss a text of your choosing, shown us for every episode, and a whole tier of monthly group spell work from the three of us on your behalf. Also, remember to give us a like, rating, and review on Spotify, iTunes, wherever you may be listening to us. That helps us fight the nasty demiurge of the algorithm. You can also check out our services. He offers personalized coaching in magic and mediumship, sorcery for hire, readings, custom talismans, oils, tools, you name it, he's got it. I offer bulk and fancy readings, and Salt's books are closed, but he's got his almanac up on the Patreon. And lastly, you can hit us up on social media. I'm at Dragon Cunning, Salt is at SaltCNC, and Key is barnowl.key. Well, this one's been a long time coming, and I feel like this is probably this is a boys episode because I'm not the grimoirist that you guys are. The way that you guys kind of like have incorporated not just like grimoires in general, but like especially the Faustian genre, early modern magic into your work is truly something that has continues to illuminate me and I find really fascinating. But I famously am not really the one that deals with a lot of grimoires. Like the one that I do like consistently, the Little Black Book of Venus is very different in its genre, right? It's not
Mhm.
quite the usual protocols and ways of working with spirits. And although those spirits are called demons, they are really more like diamonds, in my experience. So this one is a salt episode because people have been asking, right? Like how many years now it's been people have been wanting a little salt's overview on nigromancy.
Yeah, it's been a fun one to prepare. And it's something that for me it was my first exposure to
Mm,
magic. It was not an exposure that went well necessarily. That was the 2000s for you, especially when you're younger, right? It's like the resources out there weren't as prominent. Obviously, being younger, less exposure to academic resources and the ability to discern what's right and wrong. But there's also been a benefit in that I've basically, in terms of like the popular methodologies, I've worked through the vast majority of them from more diabolically infused stuff when I was younger, to the simpler stuff that I wouldn't necessarily recommend today. Like I gave that a good try when I was younger. And nowadays, obviously, we tend to hit more in line with the text themselves. Although I do follow a bit more of a miscellaneous approach. I'm not dedicated to a singular system. I have conducted rituals according to those systems to the book, obviously. Predominantly the Book of Offices of Spirits, Thesaurus Spiritum kind of work. Um, and that's really where I found my niche with these texts. I have a bit less exposure to the Heptameron or Lucidarium than yourself and Key, I believe. Because for the most part, it's really been, you know, I started off with the Lemmageddon back in the day, the Folger manuscript, Book of Oberon, and I'm always been a Thesaurus Spirit, the Nigromancia fan, just because
mm,
there's nothing wrong with a bit of home baked necromancy, right?
hmm
Yeah, totally. And as was alluded to at the start, I'm a Faust man through and through. Um, love the works that have been put out through Anodia Press, which rest in peace. And yeah, namely Mighty of Sea Spirit and Magia Naturalis et Innaturalis, being the threefold coercion of hell, and yeah, all that fun stuff.
Imagine that This is just chef's kiss.
Right. Just- perfect.
Hmm.
Hmm. So, in your guys' experience, obviously, I'd imagine it's for most of us, it's going to be the ones we've worked with most. But when someone is approaching the Grimoires, where would you guys recommend to start? Because I feel like this actually, despite the fact I'd primarily work with the Book of Offices, the Heptameron is probably Uli Lucidarium is probably the actual preferable starting point. Or even the Swarm Book of Honorius, if you're willing to put in that kind of grind. Like I do prefer the early modern sources for the most part in my personal preference, but I do the procedures in the Swarm Book, the intensity of the ritual. I think it's just this beautiful initiatory process that like there's so many benefits that come from that. So much. I think it's a procedure that really kind of grants that spiritual authority in a way that other texts kind of don't necessarily reach the same heights. And so for me, I think when we're talking about like grimoires to get started with, I would say the Swarm book is probably one of the best if you're willing to put in the time, effort, and resources towards that. But I'm curious what you guys think as well on this one because I think there's so many texts now. It's kind of insane. Like 20 years ago, you couldn't even imagine this many grimoires being published on a regular basis, right? Like, do you remember when we were younger? It was like there was a few out there, but nowadays it's like there's one every a couple every year, right? It's crazy.
We are in the Renaissance, absolutely. Even just the ability to get these texts to your front door using online shipping and so already someone's put a huge amount of effort into translating or transliterating it. It's and not to mention like the ability to get some of these materials. Like this is magic that was not necessarily popular or accessible in its time. And while it's still not necessarily popular or accessible in the way that we might use those terms traditionally, I do think it is far more available to us than it ever was in the past.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, just the fact that everyone's illiterate is a big plus, but like also when it comes to materials, like the prices of fumigations and things like that are a lot cheaper. The I think the only thing that's more difficult nowadays would be animal material, really. And I mean, even the books themselves, like you said, like what would you have to do back in the day? Odds are, with a few exceptions, like the Bibliothèque Blue, for example, you'd have to be paying a fortune for these handwritten manuscripts, right? I kind of wonder what John Denley would think, seeing how big the grimoire publication industry, big in relative terms, compare would be. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's crazy.
Totally, yeah. Or just all of the legwork required to, become friends with a friend of a friend who you heard through the grapevine, who happened to know like a weird priest, and finally get an audience where he says, I'm going to leave the room with this book on the table. You have a couple hours to copy the manuscript.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's one of the things that appeals to the grimoires, right? Is that there's a literary, I hesitate to use the word tradition, but I think when we're talking specifically in a literary sense, it is probably suitable. A literary tradition. It's not necessarily one dependent on oral transmission. It can be, well, yeah, spirit initiation is also part of it, but the actual texts themselves give the procedures for that, right? Like the actual ceremony itself is the initiation into those hierarchies and working with those spirits. And I think, like, in some respects, they actually are one of the most accessible forms of magic in that way, which I think is one of the reasons why they're so popular. It's like people tend to think of them as these distant and difficult to get into works, but actually, when you really think about it, the materials themselves aren't necessarily the most intensive to obtain, especially when you compare them to various traditions across, East Asia, South Asia, Africa, or New World, African diasporic traditions. Like the materials are all relatively attainable in comparison to what you might find in those places. And so I think really when we talk about accessibility in grimoires, I think really what people are more worried about or comparing it to is like what you might find in. occult revival related practices, which I think, yeah, there it does become a little bit harder to access. But the accessibility of the occult revival is kind of on another level in and of itself. Like the various methods and resources that have arisen from that traditional witchcraft, neo-paganism, Wicca, so on, they're all very much something to which there is forms of ingress that aren't necessarily materially difficult in many capacities. I mean, it varies based on the tradition, right? But yeah, I think when we put them in their context and frame them against other practices and traditions, like they are one of the easiest ways to get going with magic. Now, are they the best way? I think that depends on the person, and I think that depends on the approach and methodology, because there's risks. It's definitely one of those traditions that one of those practices that can be quite difficult or quite tumultuous at times, especially because of the emphasis on exorcism, upon conjuring spirits that are very, very often adversarial towards you. And really, this episode is mostly focused on that kind of work. I think angels we've spoken about previously. We've had an angel episode in the past. The writings of Dr. John Dee is something we want to go over as well at some point in the future. But today, really, I kind of wanted to focus on the necromantic grimoires, the conjuration of demons, the infernal hierarchy, and the binding of the same spirits. And for me, at least, the majority of that has been through the various LBS trinities, which is essentially, LBS is short for Lucifer, Beelzebub, Satan. There's also I think the term's probably popularized by Jake Stratton-Kent, contrasting LBS to the LBA Trinity. But LBS is more like the earliest iteration of it, to my understanding. Happy to be corrected on that. I'm a couple years behind on the latest scholarship when it comes to grimoire, so this episode is going to be mostly focused on the practicalities. I do need to do a nice catch-up research session at some point, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I find like most of what we're going to be talking about today is probably going to be relative to these specific spirits in these hierarchies. We may introduce, we may mention briefly like the Heptameron Lucidarium and the seven aerial kings and so on. But for the most part, I think really I want to explore like the hierarchy given in the Book of Offices, for example, where generally, we have Lucifer at the top, often identified as the Emperor of Hell, Beelzebub and Satan, the Prince of Hell, and so on. And I think this Trinitarian nature is really, really important, right? Because it's obviously an inverse to the Holy Trinity. We come into a situation where we have spirits that are defiant to the natural order and subjugated by it, and as a consequence of that, their hierarchy mimics the divine hierarchy. It's hard to put these into terms that feel appropriate, but like there's a kind of mimicry going on, right? Like, and that I think is also speaks to the general Platonic themes across Christian theology in the Middle Ages, which obviously were increased as we come into the humanistic period in the Renaissance. But this notion of mimicry, this notion of like the lower follows the higher, right? And even the spirits who are purportedly, at least in various sources, like supposed to be opposed to that same hierarchy and order are themselves mimicking it, which I think is a kind of ironic in some respects, in a lot of ways, really.
Yeah, I think there's some fruitful meditation to be had, especially in that perversion in the literal sense of like flipping it all upside down and using it, but also like the um heretical embrace of what these spirits know, and trying to replicate its image, especially given the proliferation of like the fall and all of the origin myths for like where these spirits come from. In the beginning, it's fruitful to be like, where did you come from? And with the explicit note that this is a good technique to get under the skin of some of these spirits themselves.
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, if you, I mean, that's always one of the funny. That's always one of the funny questions. That's like can elicit a dangerous response sometimes. Is like because you don't know if they're just gonna tell you some outlandish bullshit or if they're gonna become incredibly furious. Like I don't want to talk about this. Shut the fuck up.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the really interesting things as well about the LBS Trinity specifically is the Emperor of how like Lucifer himself, right? Because we see in a number of texts like references to his accessibility. So Rudd, for example, I think the intermediary spirit is Mirage. We also have Tantalarian and Golgotha across numerous texts, who are basically like stand-ins. And the reason given in a text for these spirits to have this kind of presence there, this kind of role and responsibility, is generally because, at least in the textual sources, because he is supposed to be essentially imprisoned, locked up, unable to actually appear at the address of the conjurer. And I do find that a really thought-provoking question. Obviously, there are other texts where he is directly referenced. Svenga, you mentioned him appearing in the form of a young boy, like in the Verum, for example. Like, so there's obviously a discrepancy between the text on this one, which I think kind of fits his character, right? Like he's a very big, very mysterious spirit that no one
Mhm.
fully understands. I think that's kind of, wherever he is, there's going to be mysteries to unpack and solve and make you scratch your head. But I do find this one really interesting, and there's a couple of lines of thought on this one because, on one hand, I think we could potentially take the text at face value, but I also think there's room to analyze this from a perspective of distance, right? Like, is this because the spirit themselves are just incredibly distant or abstract in quality and nature? Like, conceptual, I mean, when we're talking about mimicking the natural divine hierarchy, like when we talk about these spirits, then there obviously has to be someone imitating the higher principles, the less material, less immediate principles. And I do find that one kind of an interesting thought, especially when this is going to go into a bit too much philosophical like territory for this episode, so I don't want to dwell on it too long. But like, especially considering how that would fit in with his, identity as king of the world. You know what I mean? And similar notions like that we see in relation to him.
Mhm.
I think as well when it comes to the practicalities. So generally speaking, and I do advocate for this, the LBS Trinity should primarily be a form of administration or control when you're performing your work. They're not necessarily spirits you want to work with directly. Now, we just mentioned like the challenges with Lucifer specifically, but also the B and the S, right? Beelzebub and Satan. They can be conjured directly. There are numerous experiments within the source text that do that, especially the latter. But I do think, in terms of like good and proper procedure, it's generally better to go with them as authority figures through which the other spirits are bonded and bound, through which, you appeal to their authority. Maybe you have them appear, maybe you have their messengers appear, which is actually one of the better ways. There's the few spirits that I would actually recommend you can just go through their messengers instead of them directly. Spirits that are licensed to speak on their behalf, much as Mirage or Tantavalerian is authorized to speak on behalf of Lucifer, right? So when it comes to the B and the S, I do think that is generally a safer approach, is to have a messenger who can speak for them and is licensed to do that. It's just a matter of vetting them when they appear, which can be tricky, but I generally would recommend that just because they're so difficult to deal with. You need to be more cautious, more respectful when engaging with them. And obviously, under Satan, there's also the four kings. The four kings of the four quarters: Orianza, Maimon, Paimon, Egan, right? And again, much like LBS, they can be called directly. I've seen some argue that they shouldn't be. I actually don't agree with that. I think they're a little bit more approachable, a little bit more accessible than the LBS Trinity. That doesn't mean they should be approached for minor things or called casually. Unlike the other spirits, I wouldn't say to them, "Hey, give me a way that I can just call you with a word." For example, like
Uh-huh.
when approaching them, I would stick to the formalities. I think that's really important because I think the conjuration process itself can be understood as very much a formality, right? A major meeting where you're establishing ties. It's two foreign parties introducing themselves to one another and establishing an agreement. That agreement may be signed under duress. It may be fraught with power dynamic issues. Definitely not the kind of relationship that should exist between human beings. But on a spiritual level, that's kind of just how these spirits operate to begin with. That's how they act amongst themselves. In my experience, that they're very cutthroat and competitive with each other, which we're going to go into a little bit later.
Mhm.
But because of this, I do think when we're dealing with the Four Kings, when we're dealing with LBS, we should try and stick to more formal approaches. Caution, respect, not veneration, never obedience. These are not spirits that we're subservient to. They're not spirits that we need to kowtow and worship. In fact, that's putting yourself usually in a pretty difficult spot. But treating them as like foreign rulers or dignitaries is definitely pivotal to engaging with them in a way that's safe. And I guess pragmatic. It's what's going to serve you best in a pragmatic sense.
Totally. I think in all of that working, especially with the kings or higher spirits in the hierarchies, especially with some of these systems being famously top down as opposed to bottom up. And what I mean by that is, figure out pacts with the Infernal Trinity, figure out pacts with the kings, and through that or through your specific guy, call everyone else and do it on their authority versus start at the bottom, go to the lowest representatives on the rungs and work your way up through there. Some systems have this built in where the lowest guys happen to give you honors and dignities before kings. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. But I think it's always important to reflect where the authority to do this conjuration is actually coming from, what you are using, what you are borrowing, what you are pretending to be before the spirits, because it's always important to remember it is an audacious act to call forth the king of hell and demand 40 million florins, for example, from him. But to the point of having no fear and standing in the belief that you're at least borrowing the requisite authority to do this and to play out this performance of Solomon or of Faust or of whatever other great magician might be named, or form of God or horrible and powerful name that you are invoking to bring them to you to say, I'm doing this thing and here's by this name or by this power because I am so and so, this is happening. I think the more that you understand what that is, the more efficacious some of these conjurations also become.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of this work really does come from that initial relationship, those ties with the senior leadership, and just making sure that those are watertight because you're going to be referencing those relationships basically nearly every single time they show up. Because when they're obstinate, when they're rebellious, who are you going to reference, right? Like, who are you going to bring up? Because you want to make sure they understand that you're calling them with authority granted by their leader. And that means the appearance of that spirit, its actions, its disposition towards you is also going to essentially, if it starts becoming rebellious towards you, it's also rebelling against its officers, right? It's also rebelling against its superiors. And for these spirits, that can be risky. They don't like that amongst themselves, despite all of them possessing that same quality. Like that's something I've noticed across the board. There are very few of them who meek and very happy to do things. I think that's kind of fundamental to the entire mythos surrounding them, right? Is that rebellious nature. But yeah, like you said, like I feel like it's a necessity, and I think you can start lower on the hierarchy potentially, especially for your first ceremonies and conjurations. I would recommend doing that to get accustomed to it. But sooner rather than later, I think it's really important to establish those ties, those pacts, to make those agreements because that license is gonna basically carry you through the rest of the work. Yeah.
I was gonna ask, like, in your experience, in summoning some of these spirits prior to doing that particular pact, was it harder? Was it more difficult to motivate them to work with you? And I don't just mean in the compulsory way, because not every interaction with a Grimdark spirit needs to be so combative, right? I think sometimes we place
Yeah.
an overemphasis on just being like a dick to these spirits for,
Yeah.
and it's like, well, hold on, like that's not even necessarily going to result in a fortuitous relationship coming from a neutral place, let alone when it's already tense and fraught with this kind of tension, right? Like, did you find that it improved because you had kind of that stamp from their chiefs?
For most of them, yes. So there was an increase in amicability, which with these spirits, like you're saying, right? Like the combative approach is still really the last resort. You do resort to that faster than with other systems of practice, like, but it is still not the ideal approach. Like ideally, they show up, you have a mutual agreement. It doesn't have to be mutually beneficial necessarily. In this kind of work specifically, you still kind of wanna show some respect, some politeness, so to speak,
Mm.
especially early on. But I would say outside of that, there is also when things do go badly, that's when when you really start to see the impact of that because at that point there's just more recourse, there's more options, there's more flexibility, there's so many different things you can do with that prior license. It is, in my experience, like it is a game changer. It is something that because here's the thing: once you have that, there's a reasonable chance once you start calling them that they're already familiar with you, that they already know you. And whilst the conjuration itself, by necessity, you're already invoking divine authority, having that internal go ahead from within their own chains and hierarchies is it's just yeah, the difference is night and day in my experience. And my earlier work, once I was starting to, follow the procedures as laid out in the text, was successful even prior to working to obtain those licenses from the chiefs. But the difference, like I said, it was just substantial, especially in how willing they were to listen, how willing they were to show up. The time they took to show up changed a lot. Their general like subversive behavior, for example, that didn't change too much. They're sneaky spirits. They like to be sneaky. They like to cause a little bit of trouble. A lot of spirits do. It's not really unique to them necessarily. That didn't change so much, but it also gives you more ways to address it when it happens. Ways that are probably better for the long term. And that's the thing, right? Like when it comes to the spirits under the chiefs, there's so many different kinds as well because on one hand, we have the majority of the spirits named in these texts are peers, right? Like that hierarchy is based on the feudal system, for lack of a better word. So, we have kings who generally take on the role of messengers. They can assume the authority of one of the four kings that they're placed under, at least in the Book of Offices context. And then you obviously have like counts, you have viscounts, marquises, and so on. And these spirits also themselves, obviously, as senior leadership, as aristocratic spirits amongst their own kind, have their own servants, their own followers, their so-called legions. And this is actually one of the things that I find really interesting about these hierarchies is the nature of these legions, right? Because I've seen a number of different understandings of them. Some people have even said like they're identical to the spirit. It's like, basically a million Baals in this legion, and they're all kind of that spirit. My experience has more so been that they resemble the spirit under which they're subordinated. So there's a kind of chain of participation, somewhat resembling the notion of riding in the train, right, in Platonic terms. And through that, they do inherit qualities, or sometimes not even qualities, but offices and functions from the spirit that they're subordinated to, but they're not necessarily identical in and of themselves. So most of the time, the legionaries of Baal are not bar themselves, and not all of them can actually lay claim to his title or use his name, whereas some of them can. Like I found the legions, obviously, the legions do generally tend to have structures in line with more of a military organization. So, like when you're working with them and you have certain spirits brought forward, you can ask them their rank. You can ask them how many spirits they have under them, how many spirits, who they answer to as well within that spirit's legions, which is always a good trick when you're requesting a familiar, is to inquire about that, inquire about his place within the specific legions of that spirit, and also finding out what the various numbers, like we see, especially in like the Lemegeton, is probably the most prominent example. I think it's the one that's really dominated pop culture, so I'm going to refer to that one. Battletext always, they love dropping numbers, right? Like the spirit has 67 legions under him,
Mm-hmm.
and learning the unique functions and qualities of that particular line of spirits, that family of spirits, and what they specialize in, what they're capable of, what they're good at, who is in charge of them, can be very valuable when you're working with them. And another thing as well, which I haven't seen mentioned overly much, is also requesting seals and tokens to actually command those same legions, requesting characters to call that entire host of spirits to achieve certain tasks or accomplish them, having them muster. It's a bit of a process, but it is one that can be quite fruitful. And it's also where a lot of, when we come into like spell work, so to speak, with these spirits, for me at least, tends to operate based on that and like commanding these big groups of spirits, because quite often relying on just one can be tricky, especially when it's their subordinates. But when there's a whole host of them, they have mutual obligations to each other. They're going to compete to try and, you can dangle a reward and get them to compete with each other. There's all kinds of things you can kind of do when there's that many spirits involved. At the same time, if things go wrong, there's not just one spirit causing problems, so you want to be careful with that.
Totally. Even just like being aware of the voyeurism of these rituals, like one may be showing up, but others are always watching.
Mhm.
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, and we're going to talk about that because I think that's one of the real key points when it comes to these works, right? Is just how often is sometimes millions will show up and you cannot count them. You cannot get every single name of everyone that's shown up. And you want to be careful with that because the local spirits may not like it, especially if they're disruptive, which they often are. So I would say it's definitely something to watch out for. Um, I also want to talk about spirits who like aren't necessarily explicitly mentioned within these spirit lists, so to speak, because I don't want to give the impression that the spirit lists are the only way to do this. And this kind of touches on what Key mentioned about like working not necessarily from a bottom-up approach, but when it comes to approaching these hierarchies, there's a number of experiments within the grimoires, especially in like miscellaneous texts. So like Ascariel, Zazel, Masazacus, these spirits will have individual rituals and they might not always appear within the hierarchies and spirit lists, but they're still like mentioned regularly across a wide number of texts. And actually, at this point, these are my favorite
Mm.
rituals. These are my favorite experiments, like these kind of more independently leaning works. And it's also an evidence that they can be worked with outside the lens of the core hierarchy. Because obviously, if we assume or make the presumption that there is a consistent cosmological model and that these spirits are actually involved in a hierarchy, we just don't know their exact place based on the textual sources. We can obviously ask them that ourselves, but it does demonstrate like the we don't have to move within the diabolic hierarchies. We can also primarily emphasize the celestial, angelical, and the names of God, for example, as our primary means of conjuring them and bringing them to appear to us. But I think a mixture of both approaches, and I generally do prefer to have that internal license, so to speak, just because it's a little bit more efficient. But as a starting point, especially these standalone experiments, I love them. I really do. Yeah, they're so much fun, and they're also usually quite easy to set up. Very
Mhm.
very much so.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially as delineated in like the Faustian corpus, to use that term fast and loose. There's a lot of experiments that are not even dealing with named spirits, is dealing with shit that you find in nature if you identify it as maybe an elemental or like a wandering dead person or just a ghost inhabiting a particular place. It allows you to dwell in the world as an inspirited place as opposed to I got to call this guy on the spirit phone because I have his sigil and thereby can do whatever. It is fully integrative and operative and encourages even that perspective of like, okay, you want familiars? Here's how to put a spirit into a bottle. At this time, do this conjuration that will call anything, like notably in Compendium of Unnatural Black Magic, as it was published, which I think was a Darmstadt manuscript, but yeah, excuse me, Nigromantic Kunstbuch from 1743. Calling up spirits and putting them in a bottle. Just go forth.
Oh yeah, we love bottles here. We
Mhm.
love we love the bottles. And they can also, I mean, that's one of the nice things about them as a tool as well. Is like they can be adjusted based. You can make them comfortable for the spirits. You can make them pleasant for them. You can do the inverse of that. Like there's so many things you can do with them. Um, there's a yeah, I think there's a reason why they're quite prominent in like pop culture today, and that's just because not only is it a cool idea, it's also in a pragmatic sense very
Mhm.
useful. And that actually kind of brings us to tools as well, doesn't it? Really, and I think I actually, despite how I might come across, I am actually more of a I think the tools can be transferable across text just because the diversity across the grimoires does kind of demonstrate like there's so many variations between different scribes. There's so many distinctions, there's so many methodologies of approaching and conjuring the same spirit where, they can change the language in a conjuration, they can change the actual tools used. So I do think that there is more leeway than we tend to suggest. I think the hardcore, it has to be exact, is understandably a response to the prior like decades that came before where everything was very lax, a bit too much at times, where tools were essentially dispensed with, which definitely isn't the case. I think, but for me, I kind of stand on like the perspective that for the most part, tools do tend to be transferable between text, and once you do have a full set of working tools, you can utilize that. Like if you go for the full Key of Solomon setup, like the Clavicular Solomonis, you can use that for working the Magia Naturalis et Naturalis if you're careful with it. And if you make sure to do the requisite divinations, that's a question I've specifically asked. And whether or not that's the right idea, like whether or not you should do that, is another question. Like I'm saying it's possible, but I do think it's preferable to have done the actual work with the tools specified within the text, just because sometimes they can be specific. And the spirits are familiar, they're sworn to obey, or they're familiar with being bound by those specific tools, characters, seals. Like there's something they're accustomed to, and that familiarity is very important. We don't have oral lineage to back us up, right? We don't have teachers passing on inheritances. You can't necessarily call upon a specific teacher unless obviously you can cite ancestral lineages and teachers in a spiritual sense, like you mentioned, like Force, for example. But well, maybe not the best option if he's really being food for them. But like I think there's a little bit more discretion and leeway on that one. But I'm curious what you guys think as far as that goes.
Yeah, I think as is the case with any substitution and changing things around, understanding the mechanics of why something is there to begin with is really important, and that is gained through practice and exposure. When an instruction might seem a little odd, or it's like have these additional tools with you in the circle just in case, it becomes evident very quickly in practice why those things are being employed. So I
Hmm.
think, have all of the tools that you need because you've done it before. So my advice, I guess, is do it by the book, and then you can understand what can be changed, what can be substituted, what can be messed around with ultimately. I think there's some systems that are more amenable, like you mentioned, to just being plug and play general purpose. Like for quite a long time, Heptameron has been my go-to for that. Just because it's so granular in setting up a microcosm of control and ritual authority around the conjurer. So no matter what happens, you're at least going to be safe. So I'm a fan of that. And I think at the end of the day, an iron knife consecrated on a Mars election is going to be an iron knife consecrated on a Mars election. And it's going to be able to
Exactly.
command and compel spirits. I think, rare cases exist where the specifics are required because it's that language forms the password, as it were, to let that spirit out of wherever it might be contained, or grant you enough of the the ruse, if you will, enough of the costume, enough of the performance to make them believe you are the powerful agent that you say you are, or at least have them pretend to think it at the time, which is its own thing. But yeah, I think ultimately they're exchangeable. You can play around. There are even noted explicit general coercions, like general purpose conjurations for any infernal spirit that will work. It'll just be a little funkier and know that it's kind of like picking a lock versus having a key. There might be a little struggle to begin with, but ultimately you'll get there.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I'm in full agreement on that. Like you said, like a black knife is a black knife. At the end of the day, a blasting rod is a blasting rod. I think like when it comes to regalia like layman's, for example, or even if we're going like magical treatises of Solomon, like crowns potentially, I think we can probably say it's preferable to stick with what's given in the text, maybe. But like when it comes to I think when it comes to the more utilitarian tools, right? I think when it's not authority you're seeking, but specifically spiritual and magical efficiency, like capability or power to do a given task and that tool achieves it. I think that's when we can kind of open things up and be a little bit more flexible with this work. And I think we kind of all develop favorites when we have multiple of the same tool, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Especially, I think the one thing for me, because the spirits themselves will perceive the tools as potent. I've had spirits tell me like that the black handled knife that I have looks like a flaming sword in their vision. And so, of course, like you guys were saying, right? The tool is going to do what the tool does. But one thing I also want to add is creating the tools. In my experience, especially for like the Black Book of Venus, was part of initiation, like was part of what curried the favor with those spirits and got them to respect me and be like, okay, it is kind of like the language set that the binding that they have agreed to obey, binding meaning like a contract, right? Like an agreement. Like, okay, you make this, I will show up. And so I think that's not true for every single text. Like as you guys were saying, things can overlap. Often it is the journey of getting all of those ingredients, of putting them together, of consecrating them under the new moon. That was a Friday during the dark Venus hour, right? During the nighttime Venus hour in the evening, during, burying it and doing this and unearthing it and making the circle and so on and so forth. Like all of that was already being watched by those spirits. So that when I came around to doing the first conjuration, and spoke through the horn itself, the horn of Venus, they were like, "We've been watching you. We've seen this. Like we saw you put this together," and that itself was if it also happens with other kinds of like even celestial forms of magic, right? Or angel summoning technologies, right? Like they're watching you put these things together and put in that effort.
very true. Yeah, you make a good point there as far as like the notion of making the tools is the initiation. And I think as well, like I think that that really also speaks to the nature of this work, right? Is that it is an accumulation, it is a practice that builds up over time and ramps up. And when it comes to the actual process of performing the conjuration, that's often like the culmination of those initiatory efforts that precede it. Like when we consider like the fasting and so on, like you said, like the establishment of tools. And I think as well, like I think that's one of the really interesting things about your particular text as well, is like just how involved the tools are in that process and how unique they are to the spirit specifically. The like you said, like this is a diversity across the text, and some are more malleable, more movable than others, and others are more focused very much on a specific set of spirits, but also have applicability outside of that potentially. And I think developing that is also what happens. Like we often talk about getting started with the grimoires. What happens once you've worked with them for an extensive period of time, and what direction do you take that? And I think understanding the relationship the tools have to the particular form and methods that you're working with is one of the most important ways that you can kind of develop that, like understanding what is transferable, what isn't. Like the circle is one of my favorite examples because there's numerous spirits who have very particular circles, and those aren't actually necessarily dispensable. But then there are general circles, and I find like he said earlier, there's sometimes it's a matter of lockpicking a door versus having a key. And so yeah, I think it's one of the more fascinating parts of the grimoires when it comes to how the practice develops and looks long term and how things progress, generally speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. And even in the progression, like the spirits that you're choosing to engage with will unfold and shape you in turn, and each have their own idiosyncrasies and pitfalls in terms of how they can really affect people. So those, for instance, who gravitate toward a particular king might have to pay more attention in their life to the pitfalls and areas of emphasis associated with that king, you know.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Oh yeah,
so
you can tell.
or
Sorry, go on.
yeah, even with like very famously in the Faust and Mephisto back and forth, but
Yeah.
taking on those qualities like of the kings, I'm a an Egan enjoyer. Enjoyer being a kind of a weird term for that.
You can tell what king a person is probably going to want to work with, and it's probably the king they shouldn't be working with. Like in my case, it's a Maimon. If you can't tell, um, that I I'm sorry, folks, but the Paymon stand, you've got to stop. I'm sorry, you just stop. Okay, like I'm just saying, there's some traits. Okay, like yes, the Southerners can be a bit, we can be a bit angry, but you all need to stop, man. Like. uh, And the northern guys, they just need to do more. They need to talk a little bit more. Uh,
Yeah, cold, quiet, in the words of a close friend and God sibling, differently socially abled. Which guilty as charged. I'll accept that.
I think you got to look pretty hard to find a magician who isn't in some respect. I think when it comes to grimoires, even more, I think you need a couple screws loose to be really into them. Let's be real. It does kind of bring us to the next topic as well. I want to talk very briefly, like diabolism as opposed to a more orthodoxical approach. Like we just broached the notion of flexibility, right? And then we just broached kind of like relations with the spirits as well, and how character can be a form by which we might engage with certain ones on a closer level. And so that also, we can also bring into notions of like diabolism or witchcraft orientated approaches. And my experience has definitely been that they work. They are possible, but it is walking on such a fine knife's edge. Like, I don't want to say too much. I kind of just wanted to briefly mention this just because I do think there is more than one way to skin a cat. And whilst I'm giving my understanding and, like the way I approach this work here, I do want to kind of point out like this isn't necessarily canonical. It's not the only way to do this kind of work. It's just that this is the approach I found preferable for my experiences. But it's not a black and white dichotomy. There's blending and sometimes leeway as well, right? Like some texts tend to be a little bit more mutual in character. The Varum is probably the most popular example of that. And another texts tend to be very much hellfire and brimstone. And I do think this kind of, I think this resembles the spirits themselves in a lot of ways. Like the latter case, sometimes it's, some of them are less disdainful of human beings, some of them are less likely to slit our throats, but a lot of them really are willing to just do that just for shits and giggles, right? So it's something to be cautious of, even when we're taking a more amicable approach, is like just the nature of these spirits, right? Like the if you pick up a scorpion, it can sting you. That's just in its nature. So yeah, I think the texts are quite hard on these bindings and stuff like that for a reason. Even
hmm
hmm even if like we question the theological rationale, which there's a lot of people that I respect who do exactly that. Like personally, I don't, but I can recognize why one might. Um, but I do think fundamentally these spirits are tending towards being on the wilder side, and not necessarily in an animalistic sense. Like they're far far too intelligent, like in comparison, which makes it even scarier in some ways.
I think
Um,
a point that you raised that's really good, right? Is like it's like dealing with any like difficult to manage creature, if you will. Like, the people who know their language, who know their tells, who have that experience, are kind of like whispers, if you will, because of authority, because of practice, because of study, will know how to negotiate that a lot better than someone who's just getting into it. And when you're just getting into it, you want to have all the safety checks you need.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like you wanna develop that in a way that's as safe as possible and in a way that's like you can adjust and develop that further as you go, right? Like we talked about progression. But to start with, like you said, like I think going with it in a proven, tried and tested way is just preferable for the vast, 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 vast majority of people.
Hmm.
So we talked a little bit about tools, talked a little bit about the hierarchies themselves. And this is really the kind of focus of the episode is the procedures and the methodologies that we're using at any given time. And I guess the first place to start with that is probably in the conjuration, right? Like we were using names of God, thwarting angels, or as we mentioned, the names of the superior demons in various measures to bring them, to bind them, to have them swear an oath, to restrain them potentially. And I think one of the most common, like one of the most iconic conjurations, full stop, is the Balanesis conjuration, which we see from the late Middle Ages, but appears in various forms for a very long time after that as well. And it is as follows.
Berelanensis, Balakiensis, Pamachian and Apologesetus, by the most mighty kings and potestates, and the powerful princes Genio, Liacidae, ministers of the Tartarian seat, chief prince of the seat of Apologia in the Ninth Legion, I invoke you, and by invocating conjure you, and being armed with power from the Supreme Majesty, I strongly command you by him who spoke and it was done, and to whom all creatures are obedient. We, being made after the image of God, imbued with power from God, and made after his will, do exercise you by the most mighty and powerful name of God, El, strong and wonderful. And we command you by him who said that the word and it was done, and by all the names of God, and by the name Adonai, El, Elohim, Elohe Zebaoth, Elion, Eskerie, Jah, Tetragrammaton, Sadeh, Lord God Most High, we exercise you, and powerfully command you, that you forthwith appear unto us here before this circle, and in a fair, humane shape, without deformity or tortuosity.
And that right there, folks, is why we asked the question, what is the strangest form of spirits appeared to you at the start of this episode?
Hmm.
But we can see, like, right, with this conjuration, like, we start off with an appeal to various seats of hell, but also to the names of God, with strictures on the appearance of the spirit and the form in which they appear to us. And this is one of the more common insistences within these conjurations, alongside, like, no lying, or for them to take on a very particular shape or form. Like Swinger mentioned a youth earlier, that's also quite common to command them to appear in that shape. And this is really to prevent them from essentially appearing in a way that would give us a heart attack. I don't think it's about scaring the practitioner so much. I mean, it can be, but I also think it's these forms that they have, these terrible visages, are not necessarily just terrible in a sense of like unsettling or uncomfortable, but also in a sense that the spiritual qualities of their appearances can be a mockery or reversal of like divine terror, right? Like when you call an angel, you can go blind. If you are graced, so to speak, with the ability to see said angel with your physical vision. And in the same way, these demons, these spirits, looking at them can make you sick. They can make you diseased, ill. You know, miasma is something that's not just passed on by scent, right? Or even words, but also by sight. The entire notion of the evil eye, right? And sometimes looking at them directly is potentially basically a way of giving yourself the eye in some respects. Like they're just noxious. And many of the spirits in these hierarchies are, in a lot of ways, for all intents and purposes, kind of condemned in some respects. Like they don't have much to lose. And so if their impulses, if they appear and they're just like, "Oh, I feel like being a bit of a bastard today," they will. That's kind of what they'll do. So it's something not to dispense with. Like it is an important part of the procedures. And we do see similar notions of this miasma, right? When we're talking about like noxious breath of the spirits in the Asgawesha of Armageddon, for example. And this is also, it's the same reason why we don't want to be conjuring them in the bedroom or the household if at all possible. And the effects of that are annoying when it's just one spirit. But like Sfinger said earlier, it's rarely just one. There's always loads of them watching. And sometimes we call just one of them and a whole host of them show up. Sometimes you can call many of them and only one shows up and it's like, okay, the
Hmm.
others can't make it. He's lying. Don't let him get away with that. Uh,
The classic, good conjurer, my master is otherwise deposed. And it's like, the force of my deposition is stronger. Fetch him immediately.
Hello, welcome to the Infernal Hierarchy. Today you've reached the office of Asmodeus. How can I help? Oh, sorry to inform you, the manager isn't in.
They do
What?
say that though. Like they do
Yeah, they
actually,
will.
they literally will say that so often. They'll be like, "Oh, he's the boss isn't here. You have me instead." It's so funny talking to people across like generations of practitioners who will all report to having gotten that voicemail.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I mean, this is one of the tricky things with the Grimoires, right? Is because when that happens, you kind of have to be a Karen about it. Like, let me speak to your manager, please. Like, but when they do finally show up, I think one thing to remember as well, right, is like them appearing with a host of spirits behind them. It's not just because those spirits are hanging around like that. It's their entourage, right? Like these are officials, they're subordinates, they're heralds that announce them, messengers that appear in their name. And it is important to be mindful of that. It isn't always a problem. Sometimes, in fact, like I found the more of them that show up, generally the better the conjuration is actually going to go. Because when they're showing up with a whole retinue attached to them, it's a sign that they're probably taking you more seriously because we're essentially going from a more private meeting to something that's more akin to a state visit, albeit a state which you probably have a frosty relationship with most of the time, but it is a situation where they're appearing with a whole host of spirits, right? Like it's also a way for them to celebrate their pride, to demonstrate their strength to us. Behold, this is my kingdom, these are my subjects. And you can use that. You can indulge them in that if you want to. Or you can even call upon your own allies and spirits to kind of do the same, right? Meet them on a playing field and make sure they understand it's a level playing field, or not even level really. Because I mean, and keep in mind as well, you're kind of doing that from the get go. Because when we're performing these conjurations, we're often invoking numerous names of gods, of angels, even their superiors. So we've already involved multiple authorities in this conjuration process. From the start, it was never about a one-to-one meeting, because just to get them there, we've already involved numerous sources, numerous spirits, right? So coming in groups, moving in large, organized manners is kind of to be expected. And the main thing when they do this is just making sure that the one speaking is the chief, the principal spirit themselves, who you're
Hmm.
trying to approach. Because with the exception of the Infernal Trinity and the Four Kings, whose offices do kind of warrant giving them respect and giving them the leeway to do that, try to insist they come themselves, not sending messengers and officers on their behalf, or standing behind and above whilst other spirits speak for them. Even if that spirit is licensed to do so, always verify that if you're doing that with the Kings or LBS. It's just a matter of making sure that they don't look down on you. Like if they're showing up and not speaking themselves and having someone else speak for them, that's essentially saying, well, you're not worth it. I'm not going to talk to you, which with this specific genre of spirits, right? Like sometimes you kind of just have to like lump it. That's that. If a spirit doesn't like you, that's it. End of relationship. With these spirits, it's a very different kind of environment. Most of them aren't going to like you. So the same way that we kind of want to show them a bit of respect, even as we commit to sometimes harder methods, you do also need to make sure you're getting that same respect. You also need to make sure that they're not going to look down on you for that, because they will. They already look down on us. We're primitive clay monkeys in their eyes. How dare we dirty the earth with our feet? They should be soaring above, ruling over us. Is quite often the attitude they have. So it is important to like be aware of that. And in respect to messengers, if you do have a long-standing or prior relationship with the spirit, this can be. I think there's a little bit more room to give them a bit of a flexibility. Sometimes it's about accessibility, their own business, and whilst we do want to hold the reins tightly, it doesn't do too much good to chafe them. Doesn't do too much good to push it too far. I've done both extremes in the past. I've been too loose and I've been too hard. And it's a balancing act, these exorcisms. It's something you have to kind of learn, it's something
Mm.
you have to grow accustomed to, and it's something you have to do. It takes a long time to understand that balance and how to manage it, because you will make mistakes. That's part of this work. And obviously, in this context, mistakes can be quite risky. And of course, like talking about calling multiple spirits, sometimes we're calling massive hosts of them, not just like one at a time in his entourage, but also, when we have the Abramelin, the SSM, the Magia Naturalis, we might be calling a big, big, big host of them and having multiple spirits sign a contract or pact with us. And these tend to be very intense procedures, very difficult, very grueling, but they are rewarding. The biggest ritual I've ever done was calling the entire LBS Trinity, the four kings, and essentially a massive long list of other spirits subordinated to those kings. And this is essentially unlocking the keys to hell. Like you have a contract with half the senior hierarchy, right? And when you're doing this kind of work, always make sure that you act in precedence. Have the senior spirits go first, because the junior ones will follow their lead. If the King of the East has signed a pact, a count under the King of the East has no room to be like, I'm not doing it. Or he doesn't even really have room to negotiate. If it's good enough for Oriens, Baal's going to have to do it too. Like that's how these hierarchies work. They're quite rigid amongst themselves. So when we're doing these larger ceremonies, try to go from top to down and always respect precedents, understand their own dynamics between each other. This is really key when you're working with multiple spirits from these hierarchies, is making sure you understand their relationships with each other and their interactions with each other, because they can get offended over that specifically. Like, let's say you call a king and you call a count at the same time. If you address the count first, you can cause an offense. Whether or not they're actually offended or not is another matter entirely. They might just make an issue just to make an issue, or just because it just gives them room to kind of an excuse to throw a tantrum potentially. And sometimes they will actually be offended. It depends on the spirit, but there's something to be aware of. Is there, and I think it's something that isn't spoken about too much. Is like the group dynamics when you're engaging with multiple of these spirits.
Hmm.
Kind of brings us to like the subject of when we do have to get heavy-handed, right? And definitely more often than other methods, for the most part, like, because just to get them to show up, you quite often have to resort to it, especially like when you don't have prerequisite connections and relationships with them. When you're a relatively unknown quantity to them, they want to see this is kind of, it's part of the game as much as like wearing the crown of Solomon is part of the game. It's something that they not want to see, because they find all these conjurations annoying for the most part, but it is something that they expect as part of the procedures. Is especially the first time you conjure, they're probably not going to be happy to show up. They're probably going to be resistant to that. Keep at it. They're testing you, because if you give in and just finish the conjuration with them refusing to appear, in the future when you try it again, they're going to remember that, right? These spirits have very long vindictive memories. Understanding like it was probably more common that you're going to have to resort to this prior to formal pacts being signed. Keep in mind, like, a lot of these pacts frankly are signed under duress. Like, these aren't spirits we necessarily like. The ideal is having a positive-ish relationship with them, but that's not generally the way by which they operate. That's not how they function, and you kind of have to match that energy sometimes. So generally, we would be doing it prior to the pact to have them appear, things like that. Also, when they don't comply with an agreement that they've made prior, that's really, really important, because the pact itself, they're not like other spirits. Some spirits take honor very seriously. Some of them do. Some of them definitely do. Others, they don't care if it's in writing. If you're not going to do anything when they break the agreement, when they break the pact, then they they will try and get away with that. And you do have to answer that. You do have to address that. You have to maintain that. Like, they have to understand that this is an agreement, the same way that you would have difficulties if you broke the pact, right? Like, we would certainly be punished. And it's not a devotional relationship. We need to remember that. We need to remember that we're kind of responsible for taking them to task sometimes, and making sure that we need to stand up for ourselves in this relationship. And there's all kinds of ways we can do that, right? Like stamping on the seals is one of my favorites, because
Labella's Vanilla Necrocessor has you like heat the copper seal and then put it to their wax seal to like melt them.
yeah, I love that.
Mm,
It's a classic, isn't it? Like burning and prodding the seal with stuff.
mm, mm,
And Key also already mentioned the bottles.
mm,
Mhm.
There's also as well like invoking angelic spirits, names of God, right? Especially the angels of punishment. And the classic, the OG is threatening to throw them into the pit of hell and promising to testify against them on the day of judgment. And I don't think this is an empty threat, actually. Um, Especially because you're a magician. You can ask your spirits about all the crimes and sins that these spirits have participated in and encouraged in other people prior to the conjuration. And then you can name drop these things and be like, hey, listen, I know you induced that man to commit murder. I'm gonna, on the day of judgment, when you're sat there begging for mercy, I'm gonna tell God this.
mm.
Like I said, to do grimoires, you do probably need a screw or two loose. It's not pleasant work.
Nasty.
Yeah, it really is.
Exactly, yeah.
But that's
Um,
also where commanding them by their superiors comes in, right? Because they fear those names too. Like nothing you can say that you'll do is going to be harsher than what their commanders can do.
yeah, I mean that's the scary thing, right? It's just like we said earlier, like the hierarchies themselves, they're competing with one another, they're cannibalizing each other, and they are so hard on each other. It's kind of insane. Like, it's the spiritual equivalent to prison culture, right? They need to you don't fuck with the shot caller. And this kind of bleeds into what we were saying about precedents earlier, right? And in my experience, for LBS specifically, Beelzebub and Satan specifically tend to be the whip. Those names, just dropping those names induces a lot of terror. Lucifer, on the other hand, is weird. My experience has been when his name is specifically mentioned, the reaction tends to be very, very strange because there's always kind of a reverence, honor, veneration, but also a little bit of envy. Like I picked up on that quite a few times. Like when they appear, there's like envy, desire, but also reverence. I guess like sometimes he's described in like a paternal sense, right, to these spirits.
Hmm.
And I do find that really fascinating. I think that's one of the things that's quite rewarding about this work is unpacking, understanding these relationships between them, knowing who they hate, who they tolerate, who they have good feelings towards, if they do to anyone. That's one of the fun parts about this work, really, is because they're very different. They're not most of them aren't human spirits at any point, right? So yeah, that's one of the fruits of exploring it.
I find the exploration and conversation of the ones that are explicitly noted as repentant as well to be fascinating
Yeah,
because it gets really weird really quickly.
it is. Yeah, and especially when it's like because some of them like genuinely seem very sincere in that, and then there are others who like you think they're sincere, and then like but then they continue to behave in a way that's disruptive, and it's like you're more intelligent than any human being. Surely you understand. It's like why are you doing this? I don't really like. What's going on? There's so much to unpack, and it's crazy. Like the diversity, especially like you said, like amongst the spirits who are of a more like described in a more amicable way, and the shape that that takes at times is fascinating. It
Mhm.
is fascinating.
And you know, all spirits lie, and we talk about that quite a bit. But like you were saying, with demons, you have to be really aware because lying can be very much second nature to them. It's the grimoires all kind of tend to converge on this, right? Make sure that they understand what the consequences of your relationship and like kind of business relationship moving forward with them will be if they do that. Hence why there's thwarting angels, the name of gods, stars, and things that are attributed to them and things that bind them, as well as why it's good to demand these things of them when they show up, right? Like getting the answer truthfully of their secret name, their secret seal, the things that belong to them, the things that they patron. They will want to weasel out of the work sometimes by telling you things that are untrue. But once you get the truth, that means that you're able to actually call upon them in a way that is like legally binding between you.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like it's it really is like a process, right? And it's a matter of juggling all these different factors and making sure like things are relatively consistent with them and making sure like there's just I feel like there's responsibility on the practitioner to execute things that with other systems kind of come baked into it. You know what I mean? Where it's like there's a bit more onus on the practitioner to make sure if they do this, you are the person who has to take the initiative. Like you don't have protective spirits that are watching and going to do it on your behalf as easily. Like they will, but at the end of the day, we're the one who've done the conjuration. We're the one who've chosen to associate with these spirits, right? Like you have to take the initiative to do this work. And sometimes like the involvement of our other spirits in this varies based on that spirit and their willingness to participate in it as well, potentially. Not every spirit likes that you do grimoire work. Some may even have a problem with it or forbid you from it, and understandably so. Like, as you can probably tell from the episode, it's not always the brightest work. You get a lot out of it, especially I find like in terms of raw skills and development as a practitioner and being able to do things is very valuable. I find in respect to mindset, it can actually be an imposition or barrier to other spirits. It can also impact your relationship to other spirits. Like they might not necessarily be comfortable that you're willing to do that kind of work, potentially even.
Yeah, and I think that's why because you made a really good point of Salt of saying like we will make mistakes. It's inevitable. You'll get nervous. Things will happen. They'll like things will in a circle will not always stay in the circle. But I do think that's why you mentioned like you don't have always all that extra spiritual support. So it's good to call on it, including spirits that are not necessarily Grimoire spirits. Like beyond just having maybe an additional fifth pentacle of Mars around you or doing other kinds of things. That's why just good the Key of Solomon has pentacles that help you see spirits more clearly to make that time it takes to get them to manifest visibly shorter, like to cut it down on the effort. And it gives you additional tools beyond the lion skin belt and other things to protect you in respect to Gracia, right? But that's also why you can have spirits show up and just be in the circle with you, like bring their tools in with you and be like, can you support me in this? Can you be almost like a lawyer that will like note the things that they say and remind me of what I should be asking of them, or like fill in my gaps if we're making a pact, like run the pact by you first so that you give me the seal of approval to be like, yeah, this looks coherent, or be like, no, actually include this other clause.
Yeah. Yeah, or even like documenting things, right? Like they can write down what's agreed upon and when they can be a witness to the ceremony
Mm.
itself and the agreement being signed, right? And so when they start to contest the pact, which sometimes they will do, they will sometimes try and wiggle out of it and contest it. You can call on that spirit and be like, well, he was here, he saw, he witnessed, he
Mhm.
wrote it down. It's in this big heavenly book, and I can point to that. So rest in peace.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's a great tip, right? All have your other spirit friends who you can rely on and you have a good level of trust with be there and be like your notaries, essentially.
Yeah. And I think also it's just important for balance. Like we just said, right? Like it's heavy work. Could potentially has consequences on your mental well-being. These spirits will challenge you in that respect. Like I said, like they can be subversive at times. And so having that having that practice that's probably a bit more healthy for you is, I think, really, really, really pivotal. And that can take any form. It can be an angelical practice, your regular church attendance. It can be potentially, other spirits entirely, like your patrons and so on. Like just make sure that that ground is covered. Like I would say grimoire work is probably not the first place you should start. It's something you should progress onto having a little bit of experience elsewhere, just because the risks, but mostly because you want that support network in place, spiritually speaking, because you won't get things from the grimoires that you get elsewhere, and that's not a problem. That's one of the benefits of the system, as well as one of its weak points is, for example, the lack of community dependence. If things go wrong when you're doing grimoire work, there's not the community. Like you probably don't have a teacher you can go to for
Mhm.
it.
Yeah.
You don't have someone who can guide you and give you correct instructions. There's a lot of people that want to do that. Whether or not they're qualified to, it's another matter entirely. But yeah, it's something where I just think it's important to be wary of that, and understand like the limitations of the system as well, is especially when it concerns community. There are very good communities growing nowadays, but it's still a different relationship, right, to what you would find in like a formal temple, for example, where you have a priest who's your teacher and training you specifically. Like you don't have that, which is a relationship you will feel if you are diving into grimoires with nothing else to go with, or rather, the lack of that relationship is something you'll feel. So definitely consider that. I think as well, one thing to consider is like after these conjurations, after the procedures have been performed, like how do we do it? And I think one thing that can kind of slip people up is assuming that spells are unnecessary because they can just got the pact.
They can call in a spear anytime they want. Hmm.
Yeah. And like you can call on them, you can tell them to do things, but generally, like I would, if you're sending them out on a mission, so to speak, like either do a spell of some kind, like we mentioned. I gave a little hint earlier, right? Like talking about the legions and so on, or potentially, if you're gonna have to do it without any kind of supplementary work or tools, probably do the full conjuration just to have them show up directly and strongly and make sure that the process by which they're appearing is formal. It gives you a bit more room. It gives a bit more legitimacy to your expectations from them. But yeah, spell work of, you learn it from them directly. There's some in the grimoires as well. You can learn it from their subordinates as well. But that's kind of one of the ways to go after the right. Obviously keep it in a book. I think that's one of the funnest parts of the grimoires is having a book as one of the central tools. Having them sign that specifically. Yeah.
Hmm. Absolutely. Such a great point too. At least do the conjuration process to have them show it up, to arm them. Also, bind them to the book and have them give you the spells directly so you can learn it from them.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. You've said before on the show, Sfinga, and you also saw the grimoire, the evocation is the start.
Hmm.
So what you work out with the spirit from there is what one must do.
Totally. So this was amazing. Thank you so much for this excellent and comprehensive overview of a very difficult topic. Obviously, not all grimoires are the same, and not all of them have the same lineages and histories, but this is a great intro to some of the 101 for conjuring terrestrial demons and nigromancy.
Yeah, no worries. I really wanted to focus on the mechanics and relationships in this work for this one. I think there's so many people who've done so much great work in respect to like tools like Adley Nichols, Peterson, Daniel Clark, Daniel Harms, like Skinner. There's so
Hmm.
much amazing work on that. And there's also they've done amazing work on the procedures as well. I wanted to add a little bit on top of like from my experiences, what I found most productive, most useful. And I'm really grateful for you guys for sharing your perspectives and experiences as well.
Absolutely. And with that said, our Akashic Records, mine is Werewolf's Eyes by Birch Book, because it's a bop.
Mhm.
No further justification needed.
It's got that great art on the album cover too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And mine for today is a classique, which is Children Summoned by Zealand Ardor.
Yes, 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 yes. When I saw them live perform this, I floated.
As did Ajaris and Visago out of the pits of hell.
No, literally. So fucking good. And I see that our licensed part is a favorite of yours, and so it's the Blessing for All Things from the Key to Necromancy Volume 1.
That it is. It goes like this. I bless you, name by God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, with the highest and undivided Trinity, and with the Creator of these creatures, that you be useful for this project. I bless you also with all the angels and holy God in heaven, and by the mightiest names, Tetragrammaton, Agla, Agios, Atheos, Athanatos, Ikaros, Elysion, Venus, by the four elements, by the firmament of heaven, and by all the holy words which were previously spoken, that you free and protect me from all horrors and evils, from the spirits of the air, fire, or earth. May God the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost allow it. Amen.
Let me speak to your manager, please. Like,